Hello, I'm Daniela Elana. This is episode 36, Historical Paranormal. In this episode, we'll explore the popular urban legend of animals like alligators and rodents living in the sewer and the horrors of them coming up the toilet. It's some people's worst fear. They're sitting on the toilet doing their business when something crawls up to greet them. The most famous case of animal that people often talk about coming up the sewer are alligators. During the summer of 1968, a family on a holiday in Florida made the foolish decision to buy a young alligator hatchling. On returning to their urban home in Chicago, the family's patriarch flushes his daughter's pet reptile, now named Ramon, away into the sewer system, only for it to grow into a monster and break out on the city's streets. 12 years later, its encounters with humans, principally with those who are jointly responsible for its monstrous size and strength, inevitably yield fatal results. This is an accurate narrative description of Alligator in 1980. A particularly interesting example of the animal horror film written by John Sayles and directed by Louis Teague and enthusiastically described by Lee Gamblin as a brilliant example of the post-Jaws echo horror subgenre in 2012. It's also, of course, a succinct retelling of an exceptionally prolific and enduring urban legend which is associated with the large urban centers of the United States, particularly New York City's The Alligator in the Sewers. This tale which suggests that there are reptiles living in the sewage networks underneath America's metropolises. As with many urban legends, the story persists because it actually seems to have a grain of truth to it. We can't verify the tale of posh brats flushing innocent baby gators down toilets, but sightings, some verified, some probably made up, have been a feature of the city's newspaper since the 1930s. According to the New York Times archive, the first sighting of a suspected sewer alligator was in 1932, when one was found lounging on the banks of the Bronx River. The next and most famous came 3 years later, when two teenagers shoveling snow in East Harlem came across one nosing its way out of a manhole. The Times ran an appropriately Penny Dreadful-esque headline the next day: "Alligator found in uptown sewer. Youth shoveling snow into a manhole. See the animal churning in ice water. Snare it. Drag it out. Reptile slain by rescuers when it gets vicious. Whence it came is mystery." Yes, that's just the headline. Since then, there have been regular stories. How reliable is not entirely clear, of alligators spotted in lakes, reservoirs, and rivers near the city. None of them, alas, have matched the high drama of the manhole alligator of 35. Rather than fearing them, New Yorkers seem to view the city's phantom alligators as a source of pride. For the past 4 years, every 9th February has been the celebration of the city's annual Alligators in the Sewer Day. Manhattan borough historian Michael Missone, who launched the event on the 75th year of the 1935 sighting, claims he created it not to poke fun at the story but to emphasize its veracity. The concept of the alligators in the city sewers is a great myth, and having done a little research on it, I found that it has a strong basis in reality. I felt people should know that. At this year's event, there were speakers and quizzes, and the first 100 guests received a free plastic baby alligator. New York's obsession with alligators seems all the stranger when you consider the fact the smaller reptiles very differently are swimming around beneath the city streets, and no one seems very concerned about them. Snapping turtles are regularly spotted in sewer treatment systems, but for Masson, they simply don't have the same appeal. They're not nearly as exotic or dangerous as alligators, and they're native to this area, so what's the big deal, he asks. No one cares about snapping turtles. The state's lawmakers don't agree. In 2006, they designed the snapping turtle, the official state animal. The gator legend was elevated further by Ted May, a New York City sewer official who reported spotting the animals in the 1930s. In a 1959 book, the author Robert Daly wrote that Mr. May was dubious when his crew first reported seeing a big albino alligator and various gator colonies in the sewers, so he ventured down himself to prove to yous guys that there ain't no alligators in my sewers, the book recounts. After seeing the gators himself, Mr. May had his men take up rifles and hunt them down, he claimed. His feat was also noted in a 1945 column by Meyer Berger, a Pulitzer-winning reporter for the Times, and in Mr. May's 1960 obituary in the Times, which credited him with having led a squad in clearing the sewers of a number of live alligators that, discarded in the sewers as tiny pets, had survived and grown large. While Mr. May's 1959 account seems wildly embellished at best, Mr. Daly told the Times in 2009 that he believed Mr. May story, even if the numbers were exaggerated. By the 1950s, the legend had worked its way into popular culture. In 1957, an episode of the television series Leave It to Beaver, for instance, the character Beaver and Wally bought an alligator from an ad in the back of a comic book. In Alligator, the 1980s horror comedy, a baby alligator flushed down the toilet. An unnamed study becomes a gigantic killer mutant gator after feeding on discarded lab rats that were injected with growth hormones. Even pornographic films were not immune to a gator legend. Plot of 1975 Sue Prentice, RN, involves a unit of nurses treating a team of scuba divers returning from a gator hunting expedition in New York City sewers. In 1982, a 2-foot alligator was found swimming in a Westchester County reservoir that is a part of New York City's water supply. The city's Department of Environmental Protection, which oversees the sewer and drinking water system, organized a boat expedition to capture the gator, which workers lassoed and gave to the Bronx Zoo. Inquiries from around the world about sewer alligators are still fielded by the department, whose mascot was once a sunglass sporting gator emerging from a manhole. The cities sold t-shirts with the mascot and the slogan "The legend lives" for years. The gator legend also inspired the Leatherhead character introduced in 1987 in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comics and video games. Flushed down the toilet as a pet, he becomes a giant mutant alligator who lives in the sewers. It's illegal under both New York State and city law to buy or sell or own alligators without a permit. Releasing them outdoors can result in a criminal charge for endangering the public, but many states lack such laws, so alligators can be bought online and legally mailed through the Postal Service, whose regulations permit mailing of small, harmless, cold-blooded animals. There are numerous stories about post offices that deal with escaped baby alligators. In the past couple of decades, New York has had sporadic street-level sightings and rescues. Prominent ones include the 4-foot gator pulled out of Kissena Lake in Queens in 1997, and the 2-foot-long caiman caught in Central Park in 2001. A 3-foot gator found by a dog walker in Alley Pond in Queens in 2003 was promptly named Alligator by park officials, and a 2-foot baby crocodile was spotted under a car in Astoria in 2010. At the time, police spokesman seemed to anticipate reporter questions. Before you asked, the spokesman said no cops could confirm it came out of the sewer. At least one gator in the subway. The bronze sewer alligator sculpture made by Tom Otterness and installed in 2001 as part of his Life Underground public art series. The piece of the 14th Street 8th Street station depicts a gator coming out of a manhole to bite a figure with a money bag for a head. Mr. Otterness has said the piece exemplified the impossibility of understanding life in New York. How true is the myth? Experts say the water in New York sewers is too cold and toxic for alligators to survive very long, especially if they're eating rats and raw sewage. The conditions have led to the myths of special breeds that lack sunlight, create blind albino gators, and steady diet of toxic waste producing giant mutant alligators. More simply, myth flattery. The sewer chief said in 1982 the alligators would be likely to succumb to the volume of water rushing through the mains during heavy rainfalls, or to a food source that has been, to put it as delicately as possible, congested. The other big animal in myths is rats. Modern stories about rats, however, have tended to eschew the threat of a new plague and focus instead on the risk of them growing to giant proportions before emerging from the sewers to wreak havoc. The most recent prediction of a mutant rat invasion from below the city's streets came in February when Rinkatil, the aptly named pest control company, told the London Metro that 10-inch long sewer rats, able to spawn 200 young in a single year, would soon take over the capital. You'll be pleased to hear that these reports proved unfounded, so far at least, but there are reasons to believe the sewer rats are getting bigger, thanks perhaps unexpectedly to an increasing recycling. We now rinse packing out rather than letting food scraps to the landfill. That gives sewer rats a more plentiful food supply. As with the New York alligators, this problem is apparently the result of a particular class. In Elton's Ecologist, A History of the now defunct Oxford Bureau of Animal Population, author Peter Crowcroft blames the apartment-dwelling middle class for feeding the sewer rats. Sewer rats do well in areas which are thickly populated by humans who are neither very rich nor very poor. Such people, especially apartment dwellers, tend to waste food, often flushing it into the drains in useful fragments instead of converting it into an unavailable sludge with grinding machines installed in sinks. So when the mutant rats really do take over, we'll all know who to blame. So whether or not alligators or rats are thriving in sewers, or someone while sitting on the toilet will be bitten or attacked or just surprised by a squeak or a growl, who really knows? All we know is that, is there something in the sewers? And if so, what are your thoughts? Thank you for listening to week 36 of Historical Paranormal. If you enjoyed this episode, you can check out previous episodes on the Historical Paranormal playlist or the writings of it on the Historical Paranormal website. Stay tuned, and until next week.